We would like to acknowledge that this podcast was recorded, produced, and created within the territory of Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. Our relationship and our privilege to live on this territory was agreed upon in the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752. Because of this treaty relationship, it is to be acknowledged that we are all treaty people and have a responsibility to respect this territory.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carolle de Ste-Croix. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Mount Allison University. And today we continue our podcast, When Ducks Leave the Pond. So I'm thrilled to welcome Brent Henman, class of 2023, who's a standout member of his class and a graduate of our relatively new aviation program, which is about 10 years old, and it is a booming program at Mount Allison. So we wanted to share with all of you Brent's experiences, not only as a new alumni, but also as a member of a program that is relatively new. Now, Brent's journey in aviation began even before he could drive a car. He was inspired by his family's deep roots in aviation and aerospace industry. And his uncle is a veteran commercial pilot. So I'm really interested to hear more about that. And of course, Brent's passion for flying led him to pursue studies at both Mount Allison and the Moncton Flight College, where he has excelled both as a pilot and an aspiring aerospace engineer. Before we begin with Brent, I think it's important to brag a bit because Brent was also the inaugural recipient, one of the inaugural recipients of the Royal Canadian Air Force Foundation Scholarship, recognizing his dedication to advancing sustainable practices in aviation. Brent's particularly passionate about the future of greener flying technologies and aiming to be at the forefront of innovations that reduce aviation's environmental impact. Brent currently is working with Superior Airways in Red Lake, Ontario. Brent is already making his mark in the field while dreaming about a big and exciting future for aviation. Brent, welcome to When Ducks Leave the Pond.
Hey, how you doing?
Great. So, Brent, this is a bit different for me because, as many people know, this podcast is really about me bridging the gap. So, for 18 years in my position, I have had some of the most interesting, stimulating, mind-boggling, funny conversations with alumni all over the world, all ages. And I just wanted to kind of bring all those conversations together in this podcast. But you and I are a bit different because we've actually never met. Not really.
I feel like, were you on stage like when we graduated and gave us like a pin or something like that?
That would be me. That would be me.
I remember that, and we got a little pin and a card. But I think it's really great to stay engaged with the alumni. And looking back, I wish there was something like this that I could have listened to a few years ago to hear where people are at now. So I think it's a great idea, and I'm happy to be involved with it.
Well, wonderful. Now, Brent, as a recent graduate, your journey in aviation started a few years earlier than that. As I mentioned earlier, your family has a long history in aviation and aerospace. Tell us about how your family's background and influenced your passion for aviation.
Yeah, so it goes really way back to before I was born. So my great grandfather worked in England. I'm in a factory. He was a metal worker building planes during the war, and after the war, there really wasn't much. I don't know. It wasn't as much need to build planes in Europe anymore. But there was a booming aerospace industry in Canada. So the Henman family immigrated to Canada after World War II. My grandfather started working at a company called Ferry Aviation, which is in the town of Shearwater, Eastern Pasture, where I grew up, and it all kind of continued from there. So my grandfather was an aerospace engineer of sorts. He was more so like learned the trade from working there at a company called Ferry Aviation. And they lived right next to the runway in Shearwater, which has become Shearwater Air Force Base. So when I grew up right next to the Air Force Base. And I was always kind of intrigued by all the planes flying around. There was a museum right next to like where my grandparents lived. And my grandfather ended up helping kind of start a new division of his own company called IMP Aerospace, which is a huge. It's actually, I think it's one of the biggest or the biggest aerospace and defense contractors in Canada now. And they had at one point, or a few points, actually started a few different airlines in the East Coast, Air Atlantic, and then CanJet. And that's how my uncle really got into aviation. He was in the Air Cadets, also in Shearwater, and taught people how to fly in Shearwater. My dad, unfortunately, he got sick when he was flying. When my uncle would take him up, so he never followed through with it. But he ended up following down the engineering path. So I think that's how I kind of got blended kind of in between the two, being really interested in science and flying. And I think one of the biggest influences on me was air shows as a kid. My uncle and my dad always made sure to bring me to every air show Atlantic. So they kind of alternated between Shearwater and Greenwood, and I went to those a lot as a kid. And then the other big one was my uncle used to drive me home from school 2 or 3 times a week, and he'd always have these stories about where he was flying that week, or what cool stuff he'd seen, what cool new planes he was flying, all this stuff. And like as a kid, I was always like, I can't believe that they actually pay people to do that, and you can do it as a career. And it's been amazing. One thing has kind of led me to another, and now I'm here. To be honest with you, finding out about this program was a fluke. It was through hockey. I was
Oh,
playing.
yeah. Tell us
Yeah,
about that. Like how,
yeah. So my high school hockey team, for 4 years in a row, there was someone who went to Mount A to take the aviation program, and they were doing an alumni game in my first year. So in my grade 10 year, there was an alumni game where, and they still do this every year, where the last two groups of teams come back and play against the current team. And I saw a kid he was wearing like a Mount A jacket and said Mount A Aviation. And I said like, hey, like, what's that all about? And he's like, yeah, you go to school you get a science degree and they give you a pilot's license. And I was like, oh, like that sounds awesome, right? Like I had always known that I wanted to do. I known that I always wanted to fly, just wasn't sure exactly how I was going to go about it. Like originally, my intentions were going through the military, and I followed that through kind of until I found out about this Mount A program, and it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours from home. And I was like, it really couldn't get any better than that. And I came and did a tour one day, and I remember I texted my dad that day when I was on the tour, and I said I could see myself going here. And here we are 5 years later now. And
wow, 5 years later. And it's a bit ironic. We are actually taping this podcast on move-in day at Mount Allison. And anyone who came to Mount Allison understands what move-in day means and
it,
the wonderful energy and the chaos. Where did you live? Like when you
yeah,
arrived, where'd you go?
I lived in Harper Hall. And it's funny because I was just looking at the pictures on my phone there. My move-in day, and everyone from my class remember this, it was pouring rain like the whole day. It was miserable. And I remember we were late because like I was gonna wait out the rain, and I didn't realize that there was really like a time that you had to be there. And then there was this big commencement ceremony that I had no clue about. Like I was like, you're giving us gowns, and I was not prepared for that at all. So that was definitely a weird one. And I remember like it's kind of weird because like it's only 2 hours from Halifax to Sackville, so it didn't really feel, and I'd been to Sackville a lot for like hockey tournaments or driving through going to Moncton. We'd always stop at the McDonald's in Sackville on the way back from Moncton. So like it didn't really feel like I was moving away until my dad left. My dad like helped me move down all my stuff, and then I was like, geez, like this is really happening now, right? And I've got a picture of me like laying in my dorm there with the Mount A like foam finger, my dad saying goodbye, right? So that was kind of a crazy experience, and I really can't believe that it's already been that long now. So
And really, your experience, I think a lot about the classes of 2020 and 21 and 22 and 23, because your experience when you arrived in 2019, you probably had in your head kind of what it would look like or what it would feel
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the pandemic happened.
Yeah, not only that, but that was also the year that the faculty went on strike. So I was actually only at like first semester. I played hockey in Nova Scotia, so I was kind of traveling a lot back and forth. So like I was in New Brunswick for the first semester, still back and forth between Nova Scotia a lot. Second semester, I probably slept in my dorm room for like 20 nights because we had the strike. Then it was reading week. We came back for a week, and then it was COVID. And I remember like they had said like, look, if you move out by like the end of tomorrow, we'll give you like 45% of your dorm room money back. And I was like, well, I only have 2 hours to drive. So I put everything in my car and I was gone.
Yeah.
So first year, especially was like, I don't know, it felt like I was probably home more than I was there. And then COVID was, uh, COVID was really actually good for aviation students because flying didn't change at all. And a lot of your classes were online and recorded. So it actually made it a lot easier to manage your schedule because you could go to school when you weren't flying as per se, right? And any nice day you could go flying. So that was honestly the biggest blessing. And I was actually really grateful for that. And it probably made my experience a lot less stressful and a lot easier. So I'm probably one of the few people that I was actually grateful for that.
I've always said that it's so important to, as we were going through COVID, I tell everyone just try and find the blessings of COVID. And there were some for a
Yeah,
lot of people, right?
for sure.
But you're kind of alluded to this in your comments. It really leads into my next question, because Mount Allison's aviation program is pretty unique because it blends academic learning and practical flight training, a lot of back and forth from the Moncton Airport and the Moncton Flight College. That's a lot, right? It's a lot for the aviation students to juggle. How do you
Yeah.
think your education at Mount Allison and at the Moncton Flight School prepared you for your current position at Superior Airways?
Yeah, and I always say it is a unique program because when I tell people about it, I'm like, yeah, I have a bachelor of science in aviation and physics, and you get all these licenses, and I did it in 4 years, and they're like, oh, like did you like a lot of people think maybe you like fly in the summer and go to school in over the school year, and I'm like, no, like we do it all at once. So I think it prepared me really well, and there's a few like really cool classes. So Fraser, or that's Professor Turner, I guess, to most people, taught the physics of flight or physics of aviation class, which I thought was a really helpful class. Really, like a lot of these companies, they want you to understand the planes that you're flying, the way they work, and what to do if something goes wrong. And I feel like that class really gave you like a really good fundamental understanding of like, okay, like as a pilot, I'm flying the plane, but what is the plane doing behind the scenes type thing. Another thing that, especially, so one of the biggest differences between flying in Moncton and flying where I'm at, I fly all through Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. And one of the big differences between here and Moncton is Moncton, obviously, because it's a pretty high population area and being so close to Halifax, there's a lot of air traffic there. And that means that there's really good weather systems. There's really good weather reporting systems. There's really good forecasts. You have a lot of access to decide like, okay, like, is this flight going to go or not? Can I go flying today? Up here, it's a lot more being able to interpret weather and look out the window and say like, okay, am I going to go on my next flight or should we do it tomorrow? And a big thing, and a shout out to Dr. Kirk for this. He teaches every aviation student takes gens 1 and 2, and I call it, but it's weather and climate systems basically. And there's 2 classes you kind of have to take, and those give you such a good fundamental understanding of weather concepts that hold true throughout aviation. And like, even yesterday, like these little things like the pressure dropping, and that tomorrow's not going to be a great day of flying. Or one of the big things that we see up here is like the wind will completely change direction and we'll switch runways, and we know like, okay, that's a sign that tomorrow the weather's not going to be great. Or things like, looking at clouds and saying, okay, identifying that type of cloud and the hazards that are involved in that. These are things that, like, yes, you do learn in flight school, but when you're doing an entire university course on it, I think it gives you such a good understanding.
Well,
And
if anyone who's lived on the Tantramar Marsh understands the wind. It's
yes,
it's 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 a cultural phenomenon, isn't
yeah,
it?
100%. And I know, like, I've been driving back. I made the drive between Sackville and Halifax more times than I can count. I could probably do it asleep by now. And I watched an 18-wheeler going across the marsh get blown over by the wind. Like, it just completely flipped. So it must have been empty. And I was sitting there in my car, and, like, I remember, like, it's a weird thing because when you're flying and it's windy, you kind of have to, they do these things called aileron inputs, and you have to turn your yoke into the wind to keep the plane straight. And I was sitting there with my car turning the wheel to the left to get it to go straight because it was so windy that day, right? So that's yeah, that's something we're really used to in Sackville. So for sure.
Well, listen, Brent, you've spoken so eloquently about some of the courses you've taken at Mount Allison and how they've helped you. In all fairness, I'm going to ask this question. Were there any gaps in the theory you learned at Mount A and at the Moncton Flight College and the realities of the real world operations that you're discovering now that you started flying professionally?
Yeah, so the big one, and this is another really good course, was we did the business of aviation taught by Tom Mackham. He's a captain for WestJet, and he talks all about, like, airline economics. And at the end of the day, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't realize, is airlines, like the small companies that you'll start to work for, their goal is to make money, right? They have to make money. Um,
100%.
so when you come to a place as a new pilot, you're used to being at the Moncton Flight College where their only goal is to get you trained and get you flying as much as possible. But when you show up to one of these, a new business, their goal is to make money. So if you show up and you're getting ready to go training and someone calls and says, hey, like, I need a flight full of groceries brought to this location, and you were supposed to be training that day, it's very easy for your training to get bumped. And that's something that you kind of have to get used to being, like, a brand new pilot, is like your training definitely isn't the top priority because it's a business, right? And that's like a mindset that you have to get in your head, is that, okay, I'm here to help the company and make money. Like, obviously they're going to help me by getting me to fly, but there's a lot of other things that you don't realize that kind of go into flying. Like, where I work, I spend a lot of time driving a forklift, loading and offloading trucks, 18-wheelers, loading the planes, offloading the planes, all kinds of other things, washing the planes. So, like, there's a lot of things that you kind of don't think about. On the flying aspect, one thing that you really can't be prepared for, and it goes back to the kind of the density of the airspace in Moncton. Um, a lot of northern flying, there's no radar and there's no air traffic control, which is something that's really odd for people that learned how to fly in Moncton. In Moncton, you're really kind of lucky to have an international airport that has a tower that can see you all the time. When you're flying in uncontrolled airspace, you're relying on knowing where you're at and where everyone else is at. And the radios up here, like, people are talking on the radios constantly. Um,
And you're
and
picking this up as you're flying?
yeah, and you are kind of doing your own air traffic control in your head, which I know, like, it sounds scary, but then it also
Yes, yes.
comes,
On
it,
behalf of everyone listening,
yeah,
yes, that sounds scary, Brent.
yeah, it comes back to then things that you learn in geography classes, like, identifying landmarks, making a really good mental picture in your head. So, like, here, there's no buildings where I fly, really. So it's all lakes. Like, everybody makes their position reports. Everybody's flying in reference to these different lakes that are around. I'm over this lake. I'm going this way.
Did,
Um, so,
did you
so
take geography at Mount Allison too?
so yeah, I took Gens 1 and 2. I took a lot of environmental science classes. I took limnology, which is all about lakes and freshwater systems. So that's actually been really helpful for this, for navigating. Like, there's a lot of different things that you learn. Like, one thing I learned that was really helpful in one of Dr. Kirk's limnology classes is, like, looking at the water and reading the wind directions. So there's these little like foam bubbles that form on the top of the water that run in the same direction that the wind's going. So you can look down at those and say like, okay, the wind's coming from this way. I'm going to use this runway because once again in Moncton, you call and you say like, hey, I'm coming inbound to land, and they tell you what runway to land on. They tell you where all the traffic's at. When you fly outside of controlled airspace, you pick which runway you're landing on, and you have to make sure that there's no other planes landing on the runway at the same time. So it's like you kind of are using all these visual cues, the way the trees are blowing, the way the water's moving, and same as like, okay, if you see white caps in the water, like you know that it's going to be really gusty, and you have to kind of plan ahead for that, change your flap setting. So there's all these things that like that the geography side of thing for Mount A really blends into it, and that's like one of the big things I can say about the Mount A program. They call it like interdisciplinary, and it really is because I took a lot of geography classes, I took a lot of physics classes, took a lot of astronomy classes.
And you're a physics minor, aren't you?
Yeah, so I minored in physics and astronomy, and I was probably like one or two classes away from minoring in geography, and I was kind of looking at it and saying like, do I really need to do three minors? And I decided against that, which is understandable. But I did really like. I probably still took 5 or 6 geography classes at least. So you kind of get a good melting pot of all of that stuff leading the program.
Now, Brent, we know that you're in Red Lake, Ontario. For those of us listening in, can you use your geography and tell us, if we picture the map of Ontario in our heads, where that is?
Yeah. So the easiest way to describe it, it's about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. So it's north of Lake Superior. So that's why like we're called Superior Airways. It comes from that. But it's closer to the Manitoba border than it is to any big town in Ontario, really. So when I travel, I go to Manitoba, I go to Winnipeg, and then I go home. So it's when people don't really know where I'm at, I just say like, oh, I live outside of Winnipeg, because it's honestly easier to describe it than saying that it's northwest of Thunder Bay, above Dryden, east of Kenora. Like it's really
It's up there.
It really is. So like, and I've been really fortunate to fly to some places that are really north in Manitoba. So like Island Lake, Fort Severn is right on the bottom of James Bay and the Hudson's Bay. So I've been able to see some cool stuff flying up north for sure.
Has it been challenging to leave that maritime bubble, that that shearwater bubble, that Mount A bubble?
Yeah.
Has that been?
Yeah.
How long have you been there?
I've been here. I graduated from Mount A on May 15th, and I started here May 18th of last year. So it was pretty much immediate. It was a 40-hour drive from home, and I'd say it's definitely the most challenging aspect of a first job. A lot of people don't want to move away from home. I kind of knew it was coming and prepared myself, but it's tough. Like I said, when I go home, when I went home at Christmas time, I got on a flight from here to Winnipeg, got on a flight from Winnipeg to Toronto, a flight from Toronto to Halifax, and then the airport in Halifax is kind of outside of town. So then it was almost an hour drive to get home. So it's like 13 or 14 hours of traveling if everything goes according to plan and on time. And at Christmas time, traffic or air traffic, things always get delayed. But I think a big testament to the Mount A program is that when I came here, 4 of my closest friends from the Mount A aviation program also got hired at the same time. We got hired in a group, which has made things so much easier. I don't know how I would have done it if I didn't come with people. And like I say,
Why don't you give those people a shout out right now?
Yeah, so Hunter Morley, Alex Eisner, Kane Kaneshita, and then Alita Vandergast. So we were all in the same year at Mount A.
Wow.
We all Me, Hunter, and Alex actually have gone to school together since high school. So
Okay.
we've kind of gone everywhere as a package deal.
It
Um,
sounds like we could have like literally a Mount A sociable in Red Lake.
yeah, and you'd be surprised. And I have my Mount A sweater on still, and you'll see like a lot of guys still wearing their old Mount A jackets or coats or whatever, like going flying.
Yeah.
So that's kind of something that's really cool, and I'd hope to see more Mount A people here in the future. So
So, oh, so are we. So are
yeah,
we. The aviation program is growing in leaps and bounds. So thank you for being able to really articulate
yeah,
why it's
yeah,
been so successful.
yeah, for sure.
And of course, it's the great mix of people, right?
Yeah,
Faculty, students, staff.
yep,
Now, listen, you also had some pretty great summer jobs as a student, or a great summer
yeah.
job. And this included your time with the Canadian Coast Guard Shore Rescue. Describe what that was like, because that's a bit
Yeah,
different than what you're doing now.
yeah. So it actually has a lot of similarities. So I worked for the Canadian Coast Guard Inshore Rescue between the summers in university. It's part of the federal student work experience program. So honestly, if I didn't already know how to fly, I probably never would have left the Coast Guard. It was one of the coolest jobs in the world. So we're basically the best way to describe it is like we're 911 on the water. So if somebody calls 911 anywhere near the water, they'll send they'll send a Coast Guard boat to go help them. And a lot of times it's things like boats taking on water, fires, people drowning. A big one I was really lucky to work out of Halifax, and a big one was the beaches in Nova Scotia have really bad rip tides, and people that would get swept out in the ocean, and they couldn't swim back. um so a lot of it actually has a lot in common with aviation as far as driving a boat. It's all based on following GPS tracks, following headings, navigation, using geography to know your waypoints, know your way around. And someone that I worked with kind of joked and said, "You're one of the few people that can navigate Halifax or the shoreline of Nova Scotia by water and by air." So I mean, that was something. It actually came in really handy, like knowing some of the bays and stuff that I'd fly over, like and seeing it. I feel like I had a really good mental picture of where I was at because I'd flown over all these places. But in the Coast Guard, you work under, or in my realm in the Coast Guard, you work under an umbrella called JRCC, which is the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, and that's kind of a joint operation between the Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Coast Guard. So any time that they would, for example, like we would have helicopters from the Air Force Base in Shearwater that would come help on our calls if they were looking for somebody in the water. Like I found that was like kind of a really cool tie into what I was doing, and it also made me realize that like and I didn't really know this at the start, but it kind of made me, and I think we'll touch on this later, but it gave me an aspiration to say like, hey, look, I'd love to get back into the search and rescue thing from the air standpoint, right? Like I've done it from the water, and I think that would be something really cool to do from the air, to say like, hey, like, to see it from the other side of things. So I think surprisingly, it actually merged really well with what I was learning in school and my goals in life, and kind of helped me decide what I might want to end up doing for sure.
Like all good summer jobs do, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Wow.
sure.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Brent, going back to the work you're doing now, one of the things that we, of course, as Mount Allison does, is that we talk a lot about community. We
Yep.
talk a lot, when you're a student here, you're more than just a fine arts student or an aviation student. You're really a student that we really want to engage students in the life of their communities. And the work you're doing now, you're literally delivering food and medicine to communities who could not possibly access this with that in a timely way without the work that you folks do in your field
Yep.
in aviation. How has the experience of being in northern remote communities shaped your perspective on aviation and on community service?
Yeah, so that's been a really big transition. Like when you're in flight school, flying is a close, like a hobby or an activity. Like I'm going flying. I'm going to bring my friends flying. I've got a lesson today, right? This job has really opened to my eyes to aviation as a community service. So the majority of the towns that we fly into don't have road access. Some of them have winter road access on ice roads only for a few months in the wintertime. But so like you said, like we're responsible for flying in medicine, so medicine, food, supplies. At Christmas time, we fly in all the Christmas presents. We fly in all the police officers, the firefighters, the doctors, nurses. So we like, in a sense, like we're really a lifeline for these communities. And for example, like last month I flew 8,000 nautical miles. So that's like these communities aren't like they're not close to civilization at all. Like and a lot of people don't realize that if you look at a map of northern Manitoba and Ontario communities, there's hundreds and hundreds of communities that are completely off grid. So it's been really cool because although we don't live there, we're very much become a part of the community. Like we get to know the people really well, the families. Like there's kids that we get to know really well that we see like flying with us regularly. We do a lot of work with child and family services. So like kind of realistically anything that like these communities need help with, they kind of call on us. Like in May, I was really lucky to work with the Red Cross actually in northern Manitoba for bringing supplies to. There's a few communities up there that are serviced by a railroad, and with the wildfires had taken out a bridge that was on the railroad, so they were completely cut off. They had no way of getting supplies at all, and we were sent up there to kind of fill the void until the bridge was able to be reopened. So that was kind of a really cool experience to say like, hey, we're doing something that matters. And I've learned a lot about kind of aviation as a whole doing that. So there's a lot of companies that do like air ambulance and stuff as well, that are like, so like, and it's realistically it's what it sounds like. They don't have ambulances because they can't drive to a hospital. So it becomes a whole new system where like aviation's at the forefront. So I think that's been it's realistically, people used to joke and say like pilots are like a glorified school bus driver, and it's like, well, we are in a sense, because I have flown kids to write their exams in big towns and stuff like that. But there's so much more to it than that, and it's really nice knowing that like at the end of the day you kind of made a difference.
Brent, thank you for sharing that. That's really thoughtful. I used to live in Iqaluit. I taught up there for 2 years, right after I was done Mount A.
Yeah.
And I remember having a talk with a friend of mine who was doing the exact same thing you're doing now. And I asked him, I said, so like, what's the goal? What's the plan? Like, is this something you're, this type of aviation, is this what you're going to do in the long term? And I remember he said to me, I want to fly something that scares me. He wanted to eventually get into and fly planes that scared him a bit.
Yeah.
So what about you? I think every pilot has a few bucket list items that they hope to achieve, right? So what are some of the flying related goals and dreams that you have, well, still yet to accomplish?
Yeah.
Is there a type of aircraft you'd like to fly or a destination you're eager to reach?
Yeah, for sure. So I think everybody, even not even just pilots, but everybody that's watched Top Gun has wanted to be like Tom Cruise and fly a fighter jet and land on an aircraft carrier. So like that's something I always thought would be really cool. And I've never really discounted the possibility of joining the military and flying with them. It was something that I took really seriously, and I was originally going to do until COVID hit. Actually, they had kind of like closed down some of their training, and it just didn't work out. So that would be really cool. But it also kind of goes on what I've touched on earlier. And like recently with the work that I did in the Coast Guard, I've realized that I think it would be really cool to do search and rescue or air ambulance or something like that, like something where you're actually really involved in making a difference. And fortunately, the company that owns MFC also owns, or they also have the contract to do a lot of the search and rescue stuff, both in Canada and in the Caribbean. So they have this really cool contract with the Dutch Coast Guard in the Dutch Caribbean, which I didn't even realize that the Dutch had territory in the Caribbean. And they do all of the search and rescue from the air down in the Caribbean, which, so talk about like a destination that I'd love to fly to. I think it'd be awesome to live and work down there. And I see all kinds of posts about, like, cases where they help find a missing boat or whatever. And I think that's really cool. And also in Canada, they do the contracts for fisheries and oceans, where they do maritime surveillance, and they often get called in to help look for missing fishing boats or pleasure boats. So I think that's something that, at least at this point in my career, I'm kind of really looking forward to, and think that I'd really love to do. And also, Nova Scotia just opened this new service where it's kind of like an airline for patients that need to be transported to Halifax, from Sydney and from Yarmouth. So they were realizing that they were spending a lot of time having ambulances transport patients that needed to go for tests and appointments in Halifax from each end of the province. And they came up with this idea and like said, like, hey, like, let's get a plane and do it with a plane. So now they're using a bigger plane. It's called a Beechcraft 1900, and they can take patients who are like, going for dialysis or things like that, that are routine. And they'll fly them, and they do it, like a couple times a day. And I'm thinking, like, that would be a really cool job, because you talk about, your support network and stuff like that. And it's like, I'd still be home every night, which I definitely miss home. So that would be something that would be like, if I could do any of those jobs, I think at this point, I think would be really cool.
Well, sounds like you have some wonderful, wonderful opportunities to look forward to. One of the things I always try and ask our guests is, we ask you to reflect on your time at Mount A. Is there any advice? I know you've only graduated a year and a half ago,
Yeah.
but what advice would you give to current aviation program students, or those considering a career in aviation?
Yeah, for sure. So for current aviation students, I'd say, and they're going to realize the most exciting but difficult part after you graduate is finding a job. The world talk, people always talk about a big pilot shortage, and it's an interesting concept because the shortage doesn't really lie with people that just graduated flight school. There's always going to be more people that just graduated flight school than there are jobs. So it really becomes a lot about making connections and knowing people. So my first piece of advice would be to really get involved, and meet the people that are a year ahead of you or 2 years ahead of you, because eventually they're going to go on and graduate, and they're going to find jobs, and you're going to want to know where they went. And then you're going to want to keep in contact with them and say, look, what do you think about this place? Like, can you get me in touch with the hiring manager? Because I'll be honest, like at my work and a lot of the places that hire up here, it's mainly people get hired by word of mouth and knowing someone that already works there. So my two biggest pieces of advice on how to do that are the aviation society. So like the aviation society in the last few years, and like some of my friends and me, like in my second year, kind of helped take the aviation society from a Facebook group and turned it into something that is really, really prominent today. And a big shout out to Chloe Viola and Kiana Levine for that, because they kind of spearheaded that. And I was kind of along for the ride. I helped when I could, but they did an amazing job with that. And now, like, they have, they have events, they have social events, they have academic events. So I would say get involved with that, talk to people. And then the other thing that I've kind of realized in the past couple of years is LinkedIn. I like made a LinkedIn account my last year of university, and was like, I was looking at all the people who had gone to Mount A and like, where are they now? And even now, I'll still see it like this guy that went to Mount A 2 years before I did just got, a job at Air Canada or whatever, right? So the really cool thing about LinkedIn is you can see how long people worked in each position before they got upgraded or before they got promoted. And like that's a really helpful tool because you don't want to go to a company where you never climb up the ladder, right? So you can see like, for example, like where I worked, I was flying from September until the end of February, and then I got promoted to becoming a captain on the plane that I was flying. So like that's like something that's really useful information for somebody that's starting because you know that there's career progression, right? And my last point to that would be Mount A students are in a really unique position because they don't go to school in the summertime. So I would say like what I wish I had have done is when you're looking for a summer job, get involved with something related to aviation. So even like I would, if I could go back and do it all over again, I would look at the companies that I was considering working for after I was done school and saying like, hey, look, I'm an aviation student. I'm looking for a summer job. Do you have any positions available? Because most of these companies need ramp workers. They need aircraft cleaners. They need groomers. They need dispatchers. They need all kinds of people to help their daily operations. And they see someone who's in university who's eager, and you could um, you could get your foot in the door and open up an opportunity to walk into a job when you graduate. So I'd say like it's once you have your private license after your second year, like it's never too early to start like kind of going in a direction of something that's going to get you a job, because the earlier you can do that, the less time you're kind of sitting around waiting to hear back. So that would be my biggest piece of advice is like after your second year, like try and find a job that summer in Northern Ontario, in Northern Manitoba, in the Northwest Territories, somewhere where there's companies that have planes that are hiring new pilots, and get your foot in the door and make a really good impression.
I have a feeling, Brent, once this podcast drops, your LinkedIn box is just going to explode.
Yeah, well, and I think that's great, and I hope people do look into that, because now I find it funny because I see all my friends kind of popping up on LinkedIn and stuff, and it's like it makes you kind of feel like a grown up, I guess, because it's like the social media for old people in a way. And I hate to say it like that, but like it's such a valuable tool, and I go on it all the time and see kind of where people are going and what progress they're taking, because I look at aviation like a big game of chess, and it's like you can make one move and that move has repercussions. So if you step up to a bigger plane, but you go back to being a first officer, or you get time in a jet or whatever, like every move that you make sets you up better or worse for your next move. So it's like it's really cool to see other people and what they've done, and kind of say like, okay, maybe I want to do that, maybe I don't want to do that, right? Learn from other people's experiences for sure.
That is really good advice, Brent. I think that's good advice for everyone, to be
Yeah,
honest, in any career. Really good.
In any career. And like I say, like, and you could do that in any career, whether a lot of programs have internships, but you don't need a formal internship to make a good impression and get your foot in the door. So I think that's a really good idea for anybody.
Brent, this is kind of the official last question
Yeah.
before we get to the grand finale rapid fire
Yeah.
section of the podcast. I spoke right at the beginning about your interest in aviation and its future in terms of how it impacts climate and the environment. Looking forward, what excites you the most about the future in aviation? Are
Yeah.
there particularly challenges or opportunities that you're looking forward to tackling as you continue to grow your career?
Yeah, so I think like, and this kind of is what I got into a lot in university, is we're kind of at a paradigm shift in the world right now with renewable energy, and aviation soon is going to be at the forefront of that. So like there's a lot of programs going on kind of behind the scenes right now of electrifying aviation or creating hybrid powered planes. So Harbor Air and a company called magniX has made an electric de Havilland Beaver that they're actually flying actively right now. There's a company called Heart Aerospace that's working on like regional planes that are going to be fully electric or hybrid electric that Air Canada has put a lot of money into, and I did a few projects on that, kind of looking into that in some of the classes that I took. So I think that's going to be something that's really interesting, and like I'd love to, one day fly something that you know ha- is sustainable, and I'd love to see that become part of everyday aviation. I think it's really still far down the line because we're still kind of at that point with electric cars where they're still figuring things out. And the issue with lithium ion, which is what they use a lot of the batteries for electric cars, is it's really heavy, and they need to find a way to make it so that the energy density is enough that you don't have to, because the issue in aviation is if you're too heavy you can't get off the ground, right?
Yeah,
And the heavier
absolutely.
you are, the more fuel you burn climbing. So it's like I think we're still a little bit away from the day that we're going to fly on Air Canada to go on our vacation and the plane's going to be electric. But I think that's kind of like a really exciting next step, and that's kind of something that I always said like I'd love to get into kind of maybe towards the end of my career, because the thing that I've realized is like the number one asset you can have as a pilot is experience, and you have to build that experience somehow. So if I went up to Boeing or Bombardier or an aircraft manufacturer and said like, hey, like I want to fly your electric planes and I want to test them, they'd say, well, like we're not going to trust you, right? Like, you only have a year of experience. So like a lot of times those positions are kind of reserved for guys that are at the end, or not guys, sorry, anybody who's at the end of their career that has a lot of experience. Um, so like, for me, I read this kind of story of this guy who he did a master's program in engineering online, and he did the whole thing only while on layovers waiting from one flight to the other. And he did it in 4 years. And I looked at that and I was like, wow, like, because in aviation you do have a lot of downtime. So I think maybe like down the line, if I could do something like that, and I'd love to. We're really lucky in Canada. We have two really big aerospace companies, De Havilland and Bombardier. And De Havilland right now is really working on a few projects to retrofit existing aircraft that they could put engines on that are hybrid or electric engines, and they're working with Pratt and Whitney, and they're working with a few other companies to make this happen. So I think that would be really cool, like because instead of designing a whole new aircraft, they can just design an engine, put that on the plane, and you don't. It saves a lot of money because you don't have to retrain the pilots on how to fly. You don't have to retrain the mechanics on how to work on the basic systems of the plane. So I think you're going to see some really cool stuff come soon, and I'd hope to see some of that come out of Canada, and maybe one day at the end of my career, I'd like to be involved in that for sure.
Brent, I'm going to make a prediction before we go on to the rapid fire questions.
Yep.
I'm going to predict that one day you're going to apply to become one of Canada's newest astronauts.
So it's quite funny actually. I always used to joke with my buddies at school that I always thought that would be like my end goal, like way at the end of life. And they always used to kind of joke with me because like a lot of my friends took like the business program at Mount A, and they're like, well, like, why are you going to take physics? Like, it's going to be a lot of studying. It's going to be hard. And I was like, well, I want to keep the astronaut dream alive, right? And I read Chris Hadfield's book there a few years ago, and that was kind of he's like a really big inspiration for that. But yeah, I wouldn't count that out. It would be it's kind of cool because they look at having your pilot's license like a master's degree. So for the entrance requirements to get into the CSA, you can kind of like actually skip going to school a little bit by having a pilot's license. So I think like that, I've already got kind of I've ticked off a few boxes. So yeah, I think that would be something that's really cool, and I'd never count that out for sure.
Well, let me tell you, we're all looking forward to what that end game looks like for
Yeah,
you.
I appreciate it.
So now to the rapid fire questions. I'm going to say a word or two. You're going to answer with one word.
Yep.
Take your time.
Okay, sounds good.
And you have not heard, just so everyone knows, Brent has not heard any of these words.
Yeah, I have no clue.
Number one, hockey.
It's 2 words, but Sidney Crosby, I guess.
Number two, stall.
Recovery.
Number three, transport.
Canada.
Number four, aviation.
Planes.
Number five, north.
I'm gonna say North, right? Because that's an airline that flies up north.
Number six, Harper.
Hall.
7 is geography.
And the environment.
Shearwater.
I'm gonna say Air Force Base. I guess you could call that all one word, but.
And finally, Mount Allison.
I'd say home for that one for sure.
Thank you, Brent. It's been absolutely delightful to get to meet you and get to know you. And I know that I speak for all of us who are listening. We wish you only the best. Thank you for wearing that flying A so proudly. Thank you for everything you're doing and all of your classmates to bring such pride to our institution.
I really appreciate that, and I really look forward to hearing it and some of the other ones, and really fond of my time at Mount Allison, and really grateful for the program, and I'd really like to see it continue to grow, and I hope that some people listening to this might be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, because I know when I started, especially my first year, it's a lot of school and it's a lot of stress and it's a lot of new environments and my first little bit I just missed home, and now it's like in my last year at Mount A, like I barely ever wanted to leave, so I hope that other people can follow along with that as well. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you having me on.
It's our pleasure.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
A sincere thank you to the executive producer and director of our podcast, Kay, who is the quadrant intern at the Alumni Engagement Office. A sincere thank you to them, and especially to the fine folks at CHMA FM Radio who have made all of this possible by allowing us to use their facilities here on campus.
Mount Allison strives to be a safe, respectful, and welcoming place for people of all genders, diverse sexualities, gender identities, and gender expressions through education, programming, support, and advocacy. We prioritized upholding, maintaining, and honoring that environment during the creation of this podcast.